This year marks the 50th anniversary of the expulsion of Asians from Uganda, which saw more than 70,000 people flee the country. They were given just 90 days to leave by President Idi Amin or face the consequences. Amin had a reputation for brutality, and although people didn't believe him at first, they weren't prepared to take any chances. There was turmoil and chaos, fear and confusion. What followed was a huge exodus. Tens of thousands of people came to Britain and settled in cities like Leicester and Birmingham. Throughout the year, we've been speaking to those whose lives changed forever and those who'll never forget what happened 5 decades ago. For Manjulaben Suchdev, praying at the Jalaram Temple in Leicester gives her a sense of peace. It's almost 50 years to the day since her husband Amritlal was kidnapped by soldiers in the town of Kabra in Uganda, a country that was ruled by a brutal and ruthless president, Idi Amin. Mrs. Suchdev, who was 33 at the time, was at home with her family when the troops burst in demanding cash.
They locked my mum and dad and sister in a room, and my brothers were forced to lie face down on the floor. They made us open the safe. When they got what they wanted, they bundled my husband into a boot of a car. We were really scared. We were shaking with fear. Whatever they wanted us to do, we did it.
The soldiers left with the cash and Mr. Suchdev. That was the last time he was seen by his family.
I was just too frightened. I couldn't even speak after that. I was in so much shock. The only thing I could do is pray. I was speechless.
Just a few days earlier, Idi Amin had made an order that turned lives upside down. He gave Asians just 3 months to leave the country or face being sent to a military camp or worse. The reason?
Asians have kept themselves apart as a closed community. They have been milking the economy of the country.
Panic and fear spread quickly. Amin's warning was taken seriously. Each day, long queues formed outside the British High Commission in the capital Kampala for permits to enter the UK.
Are you one of the people who will have to go because of what President Amin has said?
Yeah, I'm one of them. I'm holding British protected passport.
I came here to see what is happening because I'm holding British passport and I may get in trouble.
Will you have to leave because of what the President has said?
If he say I have to leave, what I can do?
Maz Mushru is an internationally renowned photographer based in Leicester. He says he'll never forget the horrific scenes of violence he witnessed soon after the announcement. Mr. Mushru worked for a Ugandan newspaper and a photographer for the army. He remembers clearly what happened to a group of officials who were believed to oppose Idi Amin. They were led blindfolded to a lake full of crocodiles. Their hands were tied behind their backs.
They had to run into the water. If you run backwards, we'll kill you. And they killed those people, and there were dead bodies into that Lake Kyoga, which was the drinking water. And the district commissioner rings me up in the morning to go and photograph the evidence of the dead bodies.
He had met the dictator several times. He says Amin was unpredictable and could change his mind in an instant. He believes he may have unwittingly upset the dictator or his generals because he discovered he was on a hit list. Fleeing the country became a priority.
One evening, one of the army personnel came and told my wife that if I had not left that evening, next morning they were coming for my life. I actually had guns on my chest about 4 or 5 times. I've survived everyone.
Meanwhile, Mrs. Suchdev was now in a desperate situation. Amin's 90-day clock was ticking, but her husband was missing and her parents knew they had to leave with all of their children.
I didn't want to leave. How could I? My husband wasn't with me. I told my mother and father I would stay on, but they said there was no way they would leave me on my own in Uganda. It was far too dangerous.
Mrs. Suchdev told me although she's realistic about the chances of finding her husband alive, she clings on to the hope of being reunited with him one day.
My mind says he will come back. I sometimes believe it, but after 50 years, of course, it's difficult to remain positive. It still hurts, it's painful, but what can I do? It's out of my hands now. To this day, I still have no idea what happened to him. I think about my husband all the time. I'll never forget him.
Mansour Moghul was an outspoken politician in Uganda and a popular community leader. As a former deputy mayor, he had close links with high-profile government figures. This was him having lunch with President Idi Amin. Mr. Moghul knew what the dictator was capable of.
He had an uncanny character of befriending people, disarming them, assuring them of his trust, and you could be easily taken in by his cunningness, whereas behind that facade hid the most brutal character, most murderous character.
A year before the expulsion, Idi Amin began to voice anti-Indian sentiments. Mr. Moghul, who now lives in Leicester, was critical of the president's stance. But this was a dangerous move. The dictator didn't take criticism well. Political opponents would suddenly disappear.
I came to know that I was on Idi Amin's hit list. So I fled the country in the middle of the night with my wife and my children. And later on, when I was in England, I came to know that my friend had been captured in Masaka and he had been brutally murdered in a fashion which I cannot describe. They went looking for me at my home. They beat up my housemaid. That's how I managed to escape his murderous regime.
Nirmala Ben Raichura left Uganda 6 months earlier. Her husband Bravinbai made arrangements for his wife and 2 daughters to flee as quickly as possible. But when Mrs. Raichura arrived in the UK and moved to Leicester, she heard about the unrest and bloodshed and began to worry.
We were so scared that they would come and kill us at any time. I was very worried about my husband and what was happening there. Lots of people were being kidnapped and being killed. We used to watch it on the news here, and that made us even more scared.
Mrs. Raichura's worst fears came true when soldiers kidnapped her husband. He was the manager of a successful firm in the town of Jinja. They demanded money and held him at ransom at the army barracks. He was suddenly surrounded by troops pointing guns to his head.
They kidnapped him. They were going to kill him. But somebody who was driving past, who knew Idi Amin, said, "Let him go. Don't hurt him. He's a good man." It was so fortunate that that man was there. That actually saved his life.
The atmosphere in Uganda became tense soon after the announcement. The exodus, the mass movement of people who were frightened for their safety, began. Properties were seized. They could leave with just a small amount of cash and jewellery.
Everybody is happy in England.
Galaben Putney ran a jewellery store in the capital Kampala with her husband. She said people were frustrated not being allowed to take the gold they had to the UK, but there was a solution.
When we left Uganda, we were only allowed to take 2 gold bangles. Everyone used to come to my husband with all their gold. He would melt the gold and then make 2 bangles. He did this to help them. He did it for 1 month non-stop.
Some women went to great lengths to bring over items of monetary and sentimental value.
Women put jewelry in their hair. They tied their hair into a tight bun to hide the gold and diamonds. We were not allowed to bring much, so who can blame them? When we came here, people came to see us to thank us for helping them.
They left a country known as the Pearl of Africa for a new start and a new life. Well, almost 30,000 Asians decided to start that new life right here in Britain. It was a complete contrast to everything they knew and loved. They were used to beautiful weather, lush landscapes and long walks. But what greeted them was a cold, damp country, and not everyone was pleased to see them. They suddenly found themselves as outsiders against a backdrop of rising racial tensions. In fact, cities like Leicester made their feelings clear by telling them they weren't welcome even before they arrived. In 1972, before the expulsion of Asians from Uganda, Leicester was very different to the multicultural city it is today. There were very few people from an ethnic background. When President Idi Amin told Asians to leave, the council placed an advert in a Ugandan newspaper telling them they were not welcome.
We are not able to help them at all, of course, as local authority. Obviously, they are finding their own accommodation somewhere, probably causing overcrowding, but this is entirely up to them. We have nothing at all that we can offer to them.
There's too many people coming to Leicester. I mean, we're having them come all the time, every day. And I think it's causing a bit of ill feeling.
Not until...
You don't like them?
No.
Why is that?
Don't seem to get on with them. Have enough of the coloured ones as it is.
Nisha Raichura remembers comments like that all too well. She was just 9 when she left Uganda with her family. During a visit to an exhibition about the expulsion at Leicester's Curve Theatre, she told me the reception she received from local people was like the weather, cold and miserable.
Wherever we walked, there were people I could see who were just pointing us back onto where the planes were, onto where the airports were. I was not expecting to be told to go back home. What home?
How did that feel, being told to go back to where you came from?
It was an utter thought of rejection, you know. We had nowhere to go, we didn't have a home. Our life was just saved when we got onto that plane. But go back to that. Go back to where our necks are going to be cut off. Is that what they wanted?
Atul Patni is a jeweller on the Golden Mile. He was just 8 when he came to this country. His parents were keen for him to start school as soon as possible. He describes that period as dark and depressing.
They will, physically attack you, during playtime, kick you, things like that. Just generally punch you or hit you on the back of the head, make you fall down and then kick you again and then carry on with the name calling. The kids who were my age were actually taught by their parents to do all this to us, saying that we're not allowed, we don't belong in this country.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
Just a few years earlier, Enoch Powell had made his Rivers of Blood speech. The arrival of Asians came against a backdrop of rising racial tensions in Britain, but concerns locally and nationally that Asians would be a burden on the state proved to be unfounded.
They didn't ask for handouts. They went out and looked for jobs, any kind of jobs they can get, night, day, whatever. They wanted to earn money. They didn't want any handout from the government.
Although Leicester City Council did its best to stop Asians coming to the city, they came in large numbers. They went on to regenerate areas like Belgrave, which now hosts the biggest Diwali celebrations outside of India. But they've also contributed massively to the local economy. The current city mayor described the views of those in power at the time as ridiculous.
If you look across every aspect of the life of the city, the spiritual life, the social life, recreational life, the sporting life, and of course the political life of the city, and of course particularly the business life of the city, all have been enormously enriched by those who chose to make their homes here 50 years ago. And, well, frankly, we're very grateful.
Pratibha Kataria and her husband Hiralal came to Leicester in 1970. When the exodus from Uganda started 2 years later, 40 of her relatives who had fled the country asked to stay with them. They agreed. It was a 2-bedroom house with 1 bathroom in Belgrave.
Nowadays, today's time, we got 3-bedroom and 3-bathroom toilet. And still we are saying, and that time nobody say anything.
There were a lot of children in the house, and when Mrs. Kataria said it was bedtime, she meant it.
Believe me or not, 8 o'clock, sharp 8 o'clock night, and I says, come on, everybody upstairs, please. And when I say 1, 2, 3, I want everybody upstairs. And that time, children, they really obey us.
A few days after the relatives moved in, a neighbour complained to the council and mistakenly told them illegal immigrants were living there. Council officials turned up the next day.
They were surprised, and they later on they said the thank you, and they sent the letter also to us. That Hiralal and Pratibha Kataria, we are very thankful that you gave the place for this many people in your house.
The neighbour and Mrs. Kataria went on to become close friends. And 50 years on, a community that was once shunned by council bosses is thriving. Uganda's loss, Britain's gain. Although the local authority in Leicester back then didn't open its arms to new arrivals from Uganda, officials from the local council in Peterborough actually visited one of the resettlement camps to welcome families to the city. Well, we managed to track down one of those who stayed in the camp and was caught on camera just moments after landing at Stansted Airport holding her baby son, who was wrapped inside her husband's coat.
My husband said, oh, it's very cold, because that time we came from Africa, so we didn't have warm clothes. So my husband gave his jacket, and I covered my son with a jacket. And then I was just walking, and I don't know where they are taking us. I was just walking with other people to go to reception somewhere else. And it was a hard feeling that what's going to happen now.
Would you like to get all Asians out, really, sir?
Yes, they must go to their country.
Even nationals of Uganda?
If they want to go, they are welcome to go.
Rajiv Unalkat was one of tens of thousands of people who fled Uganda when President Idi Amin gave Asians 90 days to leave the country. Soon after, there was violence and bloodshed. Amin's brutal regime had killed hundreds of thousands of people. No one thought they would have to leave behind a beautiful country with its amazing wildlife, rich, fertile land, and of course the River Nile. But fearful for their safety, they left. What was your first thought as you came off the plane and you were in this country?
It was my feeling that, oh, we are safe here now. We just left that all these things happened to us, and we might be safe here. That's what my feeling, that we'll be safe here now.
It was a huge relief.
Huge relief.
Today, Mrs. Unalkat is meeting members of the Kodja Shia Ithanashri Mosque in Peterborough for the first time. Like her, they moved here after the expulsion. Faisal Abbas Rahimtullah is 93 years old. Before he left Uganda, he was stripped of his possessions and allowed to bring just £55 with him. He and his family spent 6 weeks in a resettlement camp when they arrived.
It was a very, very good welcome. We used to get very good breakfast every morning, very good lunch, tea about 3:30 or 4, and dinner at 7 o'clock.
What were the facilities like?
Everything was good. Everything. You mention it, I'll tell you. That you can't complain about anything.
Why did you come to Peterborough?
Because I want my children grown up with the community and learn the religion, and my mother also is missing the mosque.
50 years ago, Leicester City Council tried to deter Asians from moving to the city by telling them they weren't welcome. However, Charles Swift, a former leader of Peterborough Council, offered 50 homes to families at a camp in Suffolk. This was despite receiving threats from far-right groups.
He worked very hard in the background to make sure that there were council houses available for the first 50 Ugandan Asians wanting to move. He'd spoken to large organisations, large employers like Perkins Engines. He worked with the council, worked with the city to ensure that actually the first 50 Ugandan Asians that settled here got their employment almost straight away.
This was the first mosque of its kind in Europe. It was built in 1974 thanks to fundraising by the local Muslim community who were originally from Uganda.
They would get paid on a Thursday working in these factories, and on that Thursday night they'd bring their wages with them and they'd take out a percentage of their wages, and that's how we started. So it's those pennies and pounds from the previous generation that have laid the foundations to where we are today.
Initially, there were only 2 or 3 Ugandan Asian families living here in Peterborough. They then began to write to their friends and families in the resettlement camps across the country. And as you can imagine, it didn't take long before they started to move here.
We were the first ones, and my brother was he was the one who organized a lot of people to settle in Peterborough. Because we spoke English language, and that made things easier for us.
Kishore Ladwa was mad about cricket and represented Uganda across East Africa. Were you a bowler or batter?
I used to do both, all round it.
He was 16 when he arrived in Britain. 3 months later, he was playing for Peterborough Town Cricket Club and became a bit of a celebrity.
I was in front of the Evening Telegraph, Ugandan exile, represent town. Young Ladwa looks very good, and then after that I become, a lot of people started knowing me. Yeah.
Well, this is a community that is eternally grateful to the former council leader and those who welcomed them. Well, the expulsion from Uganda had an impact on non-Asians too. Europeans living there were not ordered to leave, they were not persecuted or targeted, but many decided to go because the atmosphere was very tense and they were worried about their safety. Colin Grimes, who lives at Mount Sorrel in Leicestershire, moved to Uganda with his family in the late 60s to work as a head teacher at a secondary school. He and his wife Norma have been sharing their memories of the country and of Amin's brutal regime. Colin Grimes was excited about moving to Uganda to work as a teacher.
It was the year of the Pope's visit to Uganda to celebrate the 1969.
He moved there with his wife Norma and their 3 children in the 60s. He went on to become the head of a secondary school in the town of Jinja. Norma worked at a textiles firm.
It was eye-opening and a delight to be in an education system where the students' only motivation was to learn. In fact, in my second term, I was faced with a strike of students because the teachers involved were not sticking to the curriculum. That was a completely new experience to me.
The couple from Mount Sorrel in Leicestershire remember chaotic scenes when Idi Amin told Asians to leave the country. The following morning, 30 of Colin's African students who were in lodgings came to see him, anxious to return to their villages. They were in fear of their lives because they belonged to tribes Amin believed were against him.
Sadly, by that afternoon, there was only 3 of them left alive. One of them we hid in our garage overnight and helped him to escape very early the following morning. The other 2 just sort of disappeared, and we're not quite sure what happened to them.
Idi Amin's troops killed hundreds of thousands of people, including Asians and black Africans. Although it was a frightening time for Norma and Colin, they were aware that they were not in immediate danger themselves.
We were stopped several times on the Owen Falls Dam on the way home or at lunchtime, and we were stopped and were told, oh, don't worry, they're just throwing bodies over. It was quite terrifying, but again, I didn't feel threatened.
It was very frightening on behalf of my students, but I have to say there was never any direct or even indirect threat to the Europeans. They left us alone, providing we weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was no direct threat to us.
The expatriate community were not ordered to leave Uganda within 90 days, but the atmosphere was tense and Norma and Colin decided they should move back to the UK.
It proved very quickly you couldn't get basic foodstuffs, you couldn't get milk, there was nothing being imported, there was no petrol. There was no way in which you could sustain a family life in the way in which we had become accustomed under those circumstances.
We were looking for ways to spend money that we were allowed to bring out with us. It wasn't very much, but we went into shops and there was nothing to buy. And we gave our money away, which that's all we could do. We gave money to our friends.
This is my driving licence, renewed on the 21st of July 1971, when we were totally ignorant of events yet to come.
En route to the airport, they witnessed more scenes of violence by Amin's troops. Some Asian women were injured when their necklaces were snatched and earrings pulled out.
We could see bullet holes actually in the airport, in the walls of the airport.
But again, it was almost like having a fast track for the European to go through, and the Asians had to go through this rigorous investigation and having anything of value ripped from them, and they were being humiliated and their cases were being thrown open and stuff being thrown around the place.
Asians were only allowed to bring a limited amount of jewellery to Britain.
I'm not sure I should tell you this story, but helping some of our Asian friends, they had asked us if we would take out some jewellery on their behalf. And both my wife and my daughter at the time had one of these high neck blouses and long sleeves, and had gold bracelets up here and gold necklaces underneath. And we were quite frightened, having seen how the Asians were going to be treated, that we would get the same and be accused of smuggling, which we were, I confess. We got through perfectly naturally.
They moved to Middlesbrough before eventually settling in Leicestershire. It wasn't long before they were being reunited with some familiar faces.
At one point, when I was setting up a company on my own, it was in the time of Margaret Thatcher and the Enterprise Allowance, and I would be visited by a member of the job centre who would evaluate this and tell me whether or not I qualified. There was a knock on the door that particular morning, and I opened it, and he looked, he said, "Mr. Grimes, good morning, sir." It was Rajiv Patel, one of my former students. Not only one of my former students, one of my former students who had had to be pretty heavy-handed disciplinary-wise.
The couple never returned to Uganda. They say they prefer to hold on to some of the memories they have of the people and some of the wonderful places they visited. While the majority of Asians settled in London and Leicester, some came to Birmingham and never left. Our reporter Lucy Kapas's family have been telling her what it was like to move from Uganda to the Midlands.
Half a century ago, Idi Amin made his announcement. Asians were no longer welcome in Uganda. The dictator, who had a reputation for brutality, accused the Asian population of corruption and failing to integrate. He gave them an ultimatum. They had 90 days to leave the country or face dire consequences.
What will happen to these people if they don't go by the time limit?
I think they will be sitting like they are sitting on the fire. I will tell you this. You just wait after 3 months.
What will you do to them?
Okay, you will see.
It was a life-changing moment for the 70,000 Asians in the country, 30,000 of whom came here to the UK. Among them were my husband's family. While my husband was born here, his mum and dad and all his siblings had only ever known Uganda as home. And now, 50 years on, my mother-in-law and my 2 sisters-in-law, who were just 10 and 9 at the time, sat down with me to tell me the whole story. So tell me about your memories of Uganda.
Everybody is mixing, we celebrate every event together. And there is nice memory, they help each other. And when I get married, I am only 15 years and my neighbor is helped me. Yeah, it's happy. I'm so happy in Uganda.
When Amin told Asians they had to go, the family's immediate reaction was that as Ugandan citizens, they weren't going anywhere. They'd all been born there. Here they are on a day out at Murchison Falls National Park the Christmas before. But Amin was given false information that my father-in-law was plotting to overthrow him and sent his men round.
And two army people come and sit in the chair and asking me, "Where's your husband?" He says, "I don't know, where is he?" And suddenly somebody called and he's left.
While my dad was entrenched and remaining in Kampala, she was preparing to leave. She knew that, and she did things without my dad knowing because she knew my dad would be angry. So some of the precious things that she wanted, which were like silly things, you know, like a metal jug, which we still have, right, for water. I mean, it has no value to anybody at all. And things like this, she put in a parcel and posted to Leicester. My auntie was living in Leicester. And she'd got blankets and made coats for us. And she'd got those ready for us because she'd been to the UK in the 60s. So she knew how cold it got. So she herself was preparing, but my dad didn't know.
Actually getting in the car and leaving, again, I wasn't really processing. I was just going with the flow. And my cousin was crying. I could see her on the street crying. I didn't know why she was crying, so I just started crying and leaving. And it was afterwards I realised that I hadn't said goodbye to my best friends. I had 3 best friends and I hadn't said goodbye to them, and we just left.
But it's what they were told on arrival that is etched in Fatima's mind.
On the coach, they gave us a talk. I remember the guy holding up a newspaper and saying, "See, these are racial incidents in Leicester, and they don't want you in Leicester, and they don't want you in London, and they don't want you in Birmingham. So wherever they house you, you go there. Don't go to these 3 cities because they don't want you." That was our arrival on the first day here in the UK.
Despite the warning, after a short stay in a refugee camp, the family decided to settle in Birmingham. My father-in-law, who died 2 years ago, had run a car parts business in Uganda. He wanted to set up something similar here. With the city being at the heart of the automotive industry, it seemed the obvious place. Finding somewhere to live was difficult, and they finally settled in Northfield in the south of Birmingham, not realising how much they would stick out. I took them back to the street where they first lived. It wasn't an easy return. How many times have you actually come back here?
I've passed through 2-3 times to go somewhere else, but I've not really stopped and had a look.
And how do you find it when you come back here?
It's not a nice experience. My stomach's just going around. It's, because it doesn't bring back very nice memories, to be honest, so I try and avoid coming here.
You said to me once that you found it more emotional coming here than when you returned to Uganda for the first time.
I think that's probably true. It's the intensity of the experience that we had here.
But my memory is that Haki and I were the only Asian girls throughout my school career. Yeah. It wasn't even just the first 2 years or 4. Right from the time I started school to I left school, we were the only ones.
Culturally, we were different. We spoke a different language. We had a different religion. Our food was different. Everything about us was different. And it was within the backdrop of wider media. So before they even knew us, there were a lot of assumptions about us. Our neighbours, they were retired. They told my parents that the woman, she had lost 1.5 stone because she was so worried about us moving next door. She'd never lived with Asian people as neighbours.
Yeah, I remember him knocking on the door, having a conversation with Dad, and he asked Dad if Dad could keep his children indoors and not have us play in the garden. And Dad said, no, this is my house and my kids will go wherever they want.
Despite the difficult start, my father-in-law achieved his goal of setting up a successful car parts business, and life improved, although the family could never have predicted what happened next.
This is a special Central News programme about the Handsworth riots.
September 1985, and the Handsworth riots make headlines. They were some of the worst disturbances the UK mainland had ever seen, and devastated this area of Birmingham.
At dawn, the ruins of Lascelles Road, once a thriving commercial centre in Handsworth, were still smouldering.
Around 45 shops were looted and set on fire. My father-in-law's car parts shop was one of them, and it burned to the ground. 13 years of long hours building up the business after their arrival from Uganda, and they were left with nothing. They told me they'd just locked up for the evening when the troubles started.
Then we came to home and they opened the telly, and that says there's a Villa Crosses riot going on. We thought it's a Lozas is a bit far, so we are all right in the shop. After a few minutes, they says there's a Lozas is also burning the shop. And we run to shop, and there's all the firing. But that time is a so difficult time for us, because we're working very hard, and suddenly within a night everything is gone.
People were coming home, giving their commiserations. It was literally like somebody had died, isn't it?
Despite the horror, they told me they'll never forget the kindness of others, especially from those in the Muslim community who had come over with them in 1972.
Community members came to us and, offering their help, practical help, support. One elderly couple said, look, we'll sell all our gold jewellery. If you need the money, just let us know. Amazing, absolutely amazing offers of help.
Even the bank manager is so helpful. They phoned the bank manager, said, I need the money now because everything is gone now. So I can come and see you. And he says, no, you don't come here. I can come your house.
It took 6 years to rebuild and reopen the shop, partly because my father-in-law insisted on helping all the other businesses on the street get back on their feet before he too returned. As the business got back on track and the years passed, the family's thoughts turned to returning to Uganda for a visit. Their departure had been traumatic, but with Amin no longer in power, they were keen to return.
I went back first time in 1999. Up until then, my dream was always to go back to Uganda and set up a childcare project or something to do with children. And I went into a bookshop and I took a book out, which was a photo diary of the time when Amin was there and the army were... And there were some horrific pictures in that book. I mean, I was going to buy it, but it was so horrible that I didn't. And then as we were leaving, somebody from the community, he said, can you see that piece of green land there? Every day they would line up people and shoot them. And that's what we saw every day. And after that, it was the first time in my life I thought, I'm so glad we left Uganda. Because Dad would be dead. Who knows what would have happened to us, what horrors would have afflicted us. And I think that's when I left Uganda. Does that actually left Uganda?
Despite their family dispersing everywhere from Canada to Sweden after the expulsion, they're still in regular contact, with relatives from Uganda regularly visiting them in Birmingham.
So last week Mum had visitors from Sweden, Canada. We've got other visitors from Canada today. Mum has a steady flow of visitors from any part of the world, and it's really nice for our children because they meet people from all over the world, don't they?
As for their car spare shop in Lozells, it's still going strong, with my mother-in-law, who's 80 this year, still behind the counter.
I'm going to do anything bad to my engine, is it? No. It's gonna...
This is a proper oil. Is it VW?
Okay, it's for a diesel, yeah.
My customer is still coming and they see me in the shop. They are so happy. They say, "Oh, you are my mom. You are my mom." So and I learned to speak English because of the show.
It's so unusual for an Asian woman of her age to be running a car parts shop and know about car spares and tools and accessories, you know, so that's something for us to feel proud of, and I think we've got our independence from her.
And how about you, Mum? How comfortable do you feel here, and do you feel this is your home?
Because now Uganda is nothing for me, because I don't have any family there, no community there, no business, nothing. So I feel better here because my shop is my heart.
Not a family.
And also family, yeah. Family and community. Community is most important for me.
And it's the close bonds with family and community, which is why they wanted to tell their story 50 years on and share it with their children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have only ever known Birmingham as their home.
Lucy Kapasi ending that report. And we heard there just how important it is for Lucy's family to share their story with future generations. Well, school children in Leicester have been hearing from those who left the country in the 70s about life in Uganda and the challenges they faced.
Who's heard of Uganda? That's great, it's good to know.
Sophie Canabar returns to her former school, Rushmead Academy in Leicester. She was just 6 when her family left Uganda. Sophie has fond memories of playing with her brother and sister. Her mother was 7 months pregnant when President Idi Amin told Asians to leave the country.
Well, all I can remember is a very vivid memory of soldiers coming to the door, and I tried to ask my father if that happened or not. Unfortunately, he couldn't talk about the experience. He found it very, very traumatic. So he tended to shield us from any pain. So he said, no, there was no soldiers, but I know there was soldiers.
Her family initially lived in Ilkley in Yorkshire before moving to Leicester. She's been writing a memoir, a collection of diary entries about her Ugandan journey.
We never really fitted in. It was the 70s, being brown, speaking a different language and just being different. It was a difficult time for us all. I remember walking a 3-mile journey to school in Ben Riding. Mum would always ensure that she would walk with us, but I hated it. I was so embarrassed of her. Embarrassed that Mum used to wear a sari, did not look like the other mums, did not talk like the other mums. We found it hard to make friends. There were some really horrible people and there were some really nice people.
The teenagers were intrigued.
Are you happy with your life in the UK, or would you go live in Uganda if you had the chance to?
Yes, I'm happy now because I've created a good life for myself and my children. Would I go back to Africa? I have never been back, and it's always been on my wish list, but there's always that fear of going back. And because our lives were stolen, you know, we had a house, we had a business, we had a lovely life. We used to go on picnics and go and see the wildlife. That was stolen from us. So would you want to go back to somewhere where they didn't want you?
What is the best thing about coming to the UK?
Oh, I can answer that one really easily. It's a really good question. Opportunity. I think the UK is an amazing place for giving everybody opportunities. And I say this because I grew up dyslexic and I think a little bit dyspraxic, although I've never been evaluated for that. So I found reading and English very, very hard as a child. And I thought it was because I was from another country. But that never stopped me. I went into wealth management, I went into managing apprenticeship services in colleges.
Meanwhile, pupils at Abbey Mead Primary in Belgrave had a visit from someone I know rather well. This is my dad, Harish. My dad was a teacher at a primary school in the town of Jinja in Uganda. I was just 2 when I came to the UK with my family. Feel free to ask any questions. Who would like to ask a question first of all?
Did you ever think that Idi Amin would ever tell you to leave?
It came as a shock because people had settled there for hundreds of years, and they had to leave their businesses, their houses, everything, and they had to just leave the country within 3 months' time. People didn't know what was happening. People were a bit confused that what's going to happen to their children and for elderly people.
What difficulties did you go through in Uganda?
Idi Amin had set a time for 3 months. The main scary thing was the safety of people, they were frightened of the army. Will they get killed or will they be able to leave the country without getting hurt?
How did the local people feel when Idi Amin told you to leave?
They had mixed feelings because people had businesses. They used to employ thousands of people there. Some of the people feared for their jobs. Those people who were growing vegetables and Indian vegetables, they thought they might lose their business.
You know the children in Uganda, how did the teachers do anything when they were getting bullied?
There was very less bullying, Most of the children who were bullying, the headmaster used to contact their parents and it used to get sorted out,
Many of the Asians who fled Uganda were faced with numerous challenges when they came here, but they went on to succeed in all areas of industry. Britain has been their new home for 50 years and there are no plans to leave. Rajiv, Popat, ITV News.